On the 11th of April, on the other side of the Atlantic, Cunard steamer RMS Carpathia was disembarking her pilot in New York Harbor. At the same time, the Titanic departed Queenstown. Winter in America had been a harsh one, and spring had arrived later than usual this year, as one passenger, Carlos Hurd, recalled in later years. Snow had lain on the lawns of homes in St. Louis as late as Easter Sunday, he said. Many of those in first and second class were well-off Americans traveling to the warmer climates of Mediterranean region to escape the cold American weather. And the third-class passengers were mostly traveling not only for weather, but also to meet relatives in Europe. They were mostly Italians, Greeks, Austrians, Hungarians, as well as Serbians. So the Carpathia, you see, was primarily an immigrant ship, and it would carry more passengers on westbound crossings than on eastbound ones. However, Cunard had another idea as well. They planned Carpathia's route in winter to carry American tourists on pleasure cruises to the Mediterranean. And then once the cruise finished, they would be transferred to Liverpool and then sail back home on board either the RMS Carmania or the Caronia. And the Carpathia, at the end of cruise, would sail back to New York with immigrants from the Adriatic and Mediterranean regions. On this voyage, the Carpathia's ultimate destination was Fiume in Austria-Hungary, which is now known as Rijeka in Croatia. On this voyage, the ship carried 743 passengers, despite a capacity of 2,550. And amongst these passengers was Charles Marshall, whose 3 nieces were traveling on board the Titanic. Also on board were 300 crew members, with nearly a quarter of them being Croatian sailors. And a few famous names amongst them were as follows. And there were also 7 women working in the crew. Second Officer James Bissett, who later became the Commodore of Cunard Line, writes about the wireless operator. We had only one wireless operator on board in the Carpathia. He had a shack on the deck aft of the bridge. His apparatus had a range of not more than 150 miles, and we considered him of very little use. So the reason he considered him to be very little use was because of his range, basically. However, you see, he was no joke. 21-year-old Harold Cottam was the youngest graduate of the Great Britain School of Telegraphy, having graduated at the age of just 17 years. Our story begins at 9:40 p.m. according to the clocks on board the Carpathia. Harold Cottam arrives at the bridge with an ice warning he has received from the SS Massapequa. Second Officer James Bissett receives the warning and places it on chart. Captain Arthur Rostron then arrives on the bridge and is informed by Bissett of the Massapequa ice warning. Rostron asks him to call Cottam, and when he arrives, he asks him what are other ships we have in our area. He replies that we have the Titanic, who is busy sending passenger traffic to Cape Race. The Titanic must be close by, though her transmitter is much stronger, so it might not be as close as we think, he replies. Then he informs that there is also the Californian, which is surrounded by ice and has decided to stop for the night. Rostron replies that if a ship as small as the Californian, which is by the way smaller than the Carpathia, is forced to stop because of the ice, the Titanic will definitely have to either change course further to the south or stop for the night. Either way, they will have tough time trying to reach New York on schedule, says Rostron. But that's hard luck for the maiden voyage. Who else do we have nearby? He asks. So Cottam replies that within 150 miles of their position, they have the German liner SS Frankfurt, Canadian SS Mount Temple, British SS Virginian, and the Russian cargo steamer Burma. And Titanic's sister ship Olympic has departed New York earlier, so he can also pick up faint signals from them as well. And this is in addition to all the ships he has been communicating with since morning. Thank you, says Rostron. I suppose you will be retiring for the night, right? So Cottam says he will listen to Cape Race for some time to see if there is any news about the coal strike in England before going to bed. Bissett walks over to the port side wing of the bridge with the captain. He described the weather as follows. The weather was calm, the sea was smooth with no wind. The sky was clear and the stars were shining. There was no moon, but the aurora borealis, aka the northern lights, glimmered like moonbeams shooting up from the northern horizon. The air was intensely cold. The visibility was good. The peculiar atmospheric conditions, caused partly by the melting of the large ice field to our northwards in the waters of the Gulf Stream, made the sea and sky seem to blend into one another. So it was difficult to define the horizon. So as they stand on the port side wing, Rostron raises his cap a few inches and recites a prayer, looking at the northern lights. Then he says to Bissett, "Ice has come further south very early this year. There must have been an early thaw at Labrador coast. I don't think the Titanic will run into the ice field. Californian has stopped and it's much smaller than the Titanic. Wonderful thing, wireless, isn't it? The water here is clear, but keep your eyes peeled at all times." "We will be in warmer weather soon," replies Bissett, to which Rostron replies, "Who knows what lies ahead? I'm sorry for Smith of the Titanic. After all the newspaper boasting, she's proved a slow coach on her maiden voyage, and now this ice field will make them lose more time if he steers to the southwards around it, as I suppose he will. She must be a wonderful ship, but all their newspaper bragging seems a kind of blasphemy, claiming that she's unsinkable and all that kind of thing." Bissett agrees with him, knowing that he is a very religious man. Rostron tells him the night's clear and he is going off. He goes into the chart room and writes his night orders and then hands them to Bissett before leaving, and then leaves for his cabin, leaving Bissett in charge. It's 10 p.m. The quartermaster at the wheel strikes 4 bells to announce it's 10 p.m. The lookout in the nest signals back with 4 bells and the usual cry, "All's well," and the lights burning brightly. At 11 p.m., the quartermaster rings 6 bells to signal it's 11 p.m. Most of the ship's lights are switched off, and the only noise to be heard is that of the engines. Light shines from the wireless shack behind the bridge. Cottam listens to the conversation between Cyril Evans and Jack Phillips. He smiles upon hearing the latter rebuff the former with his famous "shut up" message. At 12 a.m., Bissett's watch is over. He is relieved by First Officer Dean and goes to his cabin located below the bridge. However, on his way, he sees Cottam having removed his set, taking off his boots and preparing for bed. There's nothing interesting for him to listen to apart from the Titanic sending its private messages to Cape Race, which are of no use to him. Bissett is unable to fall asleep and so begins to read for a while and then eventually falls asleep. Around 12:25, as he unlaces his boots, Cottam decides to listen for a few more minutes and receives a message from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, saying they have passenger traffic for the Titanic. He relays the message to Titanic saying, "Do you know Cape Cod is sending traffic for you?" The Titanic quickly responds, "Come at once. We have struck a bug. It's a CQD, old man," followed by their distress position. Cottam replies, "Should I tell my captain?" To which Titanic replies in affirmative. Noting down the coordinates, Cottam rushes to the bridge and informs Officer Dean the Titanic is sinking. But Dean does not seem to be paying any attention, and realizing this, he rushes to the captain's cabin, with Dean following behind, and storms the cabin at once. Rostron is triggered by Cottam's unannounced arrival and begins to scold him. Cottam quickly informs him the Titanic is sinking, and Dean confirms this. Rostron orders Dean to turn the ship around and informs him he is coming to a bridge in a minute. He puts on his uniform and coat and then heads towards the bridge. On the bridge, he plots the Titanic's position given to him by Cottam on the chart and realizes they are some 58 miles away. Given that the Carpathia has a maximum speed of 14 knots It will take them around 4 hours to reach the Titanic. He orders the quartermaster to turn the ship around north 52 west, and the engine telegraph is rung full ahead. The quartermaster obeys, and Cottam informs the Titanic that they will take around 4 hours to reach. Meanwhile, Rostron realizes that 4 hours is too much time and begins to think of possible things he can do to help with the rescue and reach Titanic as fast as possible. He musters all crew on deck and orders the leading cabin crew members to muster all their subordinates. Officer Bissett and others are woken up, and the lookouts are increased, and additional lookouts are placed on both wings of the bridge. He then calls for the chief engineer to meet him. Chief Engineer Alexander Johnston is ordered to muster all stokers and tell them to produce maximum steam. He is also ordered to cut off steam for heating and hot water to cabins and divert it to the engines. Johnston then leaves the bridge, and Rostron begins issuing orders to his crew members. To the doctors, he assigns each of the 3 doctors a dining salon and tells them to personally meet each and every survivor. Each doctor is ordered to do this, and the crew members are assigned to help each and every doctor and make sure they have their necessary supplies with them, such as stimulants, restoratives, and some other things. To the pursers, he assigns the chief purser, his assistant, and the chief steward to collect the Christian names and surnames of all the survivors to be relayed by wireless as soon as possible. Third-class stewards, inspector, and the master-at-arms are ordered to make sure the Carpathia's steerage passengers and the Titanic survivors don't mix, because if they do mix, this can cause issues while docking for quarantine and all that, and also cause confusions. So how they do this? Well, they keep the Carpathia's steerage passengers out of their dining salon and off deck. To the chief steward, he assigns the extra duty of mustering all his subordinates and ordering them to prepare coffee for all the crew members to help them stay awake. And then they are also ordered to make sure a steady supply of coffee, tea, soup, and other related things like hot chocolate are supplied to all dining salons. All blankets are bought out from the storerooms to dining salons for survivors, and lifeboats are prepared to lower at a moment's notice. To the chief and first officers, he assigns the task of mustering all the sailors and giving them coffee. Afterwards, they are ordered to prepare the deck for receiving the lifeboats and survivors. Every crew member above decks is ordered to give away their cabins to survivors and take vacant cabins in third class section. And all the vacant cabins were otherwise were also prepared for survivors. So the officials of ship were somewhat living in the smaller cabins, and they gave away the big ones to survivors. Stewards are placed in alleyways to answer the passengers' questions about why are the engines running so loud and why are the lifeboats being repaired above deck. Meanwhile, in the wireless shack, Cottam starts receiving haunting messages from the Titanic. Cannot last much longer at 1:30, followed by engine room flooding at 1:35, and then the final message is received at 1:45. Come as quickly as possible. Engine room filling up to boilers. Thank you, old man. Good night. The Titanic did transmit messages after this, but her transmitting power was getting weaker, so the Carpathia didn't receive much after this message, except for one final message around 2:15. We are sinking fast, passengers being put into lifeboats, MGY, with MGY being Titanic's radio call sign. And these messages are shown to Rostron. He prepares to face the worst case scenario. The Titanic might founder before the Carpathia gets there. But having done everything he could, he goes into a shady corner on the bridge, takes off his hat, bows down, and begins to recite a long prayer. Meanwhile, in the engine room, the pressure gauge's readings start going into the red zone. To avoid any unnecessary worries, legend has it the chief engineer covered the gauge with his cap. The Carpathia is going faster than her built-in speed of 14 knots. It's around 15 or 15.5 or maybe 16 knots, but much less than the 17 knots mentioned in legends. At 2:40 a.m., Carpathia sights a green light in the distance, but they don't understand what exactly it is. Is it the Titanic herself or some boat? And once the light vanishes, they realize it was just a rocket. At 2:45, Rostron orders a company signal rocket to be fired every 15 minutes to let the survivors know they are here. These rockets are interfering with the lookout's visibility, but Rostron tells them it is necessary, otherwise how will he communicate with the person sending these green rockets? Around the same time, Officer Bissett spots an iceberg and shouts towards the bridge. Rostron, who is standing behind the quartermaster, tells him to turn and reduces the speed by half. Now you might ask, how did he spot the iceberg? So basically, he was looking at the ocean in front of him and he saw something dark in the distance, and the stars above that something dark object, the dark thing, were not reflected in the water below. So he concluded to be an iceberg, and it really was. For the next half an hour, the Carpathia zigzags between icebergs for 8 miles at full speed as they can't slow down. Rostron would later remark, "A hand other than mine was on the helm that night." At 3:15, the Carpathia is 12 miles away from the Titanic's position provided by Boxhole. The men on her decks see green light at intervals, but nothing of the Titanic. No hull, no superstructure, mast, or anything. At 3:30, the Carpathia is surrounded by numerous icebergs and small ice growlers. The crew hear small growlers grinding against the Carpathia's hull. Rostron rings the engine room telegraph to half ahead and a few minutes later to stop. Arriving near the spot, his crew sighted the green flare, but it's still dark. At 4 a.m., the quartermaster rings 8 bells to signal it's 4 a.m. First Officer Dean is relieved by Chief Officer Hankinson, who's already there on the bridge since Rostron woke him up. The crow's nest rings back with the usual cry, "All's well," and lights burning brightly. Bissett has seen some light in the horizon. It will be daylight soon. With the dim grey light of dawn, the source of green lights is discovered. It's a man in officer's uniform wearing an officer's cap, waving a green flare which he throws in the distance. The man is Boxhall. As the boat nears Carpathia, he shouts to the crew members on deck, "I have only one sailor with me. Pick us up." Officer Bissett goes with 2 quartermasters, and the 3 men climb down into the boat using ropes and stabilizing it over the relatively choppy sea. They row it to the gangway door on sea deck, and Rostron has oil prepared to be poured down the bathrooms just in case the sea gets too choppy for the boats. Once they reach the gangway door, the survivors are picked up using rigged bosun chairs and pilot ladder. Bissett writes that the boat contained 25 women and 10 children, along with Boxhall and 4 other men. The women and children got off without causing any problems, but as he placed one woman onto the bosun's chair, she was holding something under her fur coat. Bissett thought it was her child, but she said, "Be careful of my doggy," and he saw it was a small pet dog. Her love for her furry friend was basically, something shocked Bissett, and he writes in his memoirs that she cared more about her pet than about herself at this moment. The last people to get off are Boxhall and Bissett, and then the 2 quartermasters tie the boat to Carpathia's cargo crane, and it's lifted and stored on the front deck. Bissett takes Boxhall to the bridge, where Rostron asks him, "Where's the Titanic?" "Gone. She sank at 2:20 a.m., and excited Boxhall replies. Taking Boxhall by the arm, Rostron says, "Never mind, my son. Tell me, did all her boats manage to leave safely?" "We struck that berg at 11:40. Boats began leaving at 12:45. Mine left at 1:45, one of the last to leave. Most boats were only half full. Many people thought the ship won't sink, so they didn't get in, says Boxhall. So, were there many people still on board at the time of sinking? Asked Rostron. His voice breaking with emotion, Boxhall replies, "Hundreds and hundreds, perhaps 1,000 or even more. My God, sir, they have gone down with her. We had a room for a dozen more people in my boat, but it was dark after the ship took the plunge. We didn't pick up any swimmers. I fired flares. I think that the people were drawn down deep by the suction. Other boats are somewhere near." Rostron comforts him, saying, "It's thank you, mister. Now go below deck and get some coffee and warm yourself." Bissett writes that the increasing daylight revealed dozens of icebergs within our horizon. Among them were 4 or 5 big bergs that stood up to 200 feet above water level, and one of these was the one the Titanic had struck. There were dozens of small calves or growlers that drifted sluggishly on the choppy seas. To the northwards was a field of pack ice extended westwards for many miles. He also mentions that there was an island of Titanic's wreckage. He writes, "A mile away was a mass of wreckage like an island, marking the spot where the Titanic had gone down." About the bodies, he writes that the dead bodies were there, totally or partially submerged, but in the choppy seas it was now impossible to sight them, as white life jackets would have an appearance similar to that of the thousands of small pieces of floating ice or white painted wreckage. A dead body floats almost submerged. The water had a sinister greenish crystal tinge. People lining the decks of the Carpathia stared overside in shocked fascination and horror. For here, 1,000 miles from land, the elemental ocean was in truth a watery grave, in which, as a quick count and calculation indicated, the lives of 1,500 human beings had been extinguished without warning, plunged from warmth, light, and gaiety to icy doom. Now Rostron knew that the Titanic had carried 20 lifeboats, and most of them had managed to leave and were waiting somewhere around the crash site for rescue. The Carpathia's own passengers were awakened because it was cold in their cabins, and they watched silently as the survivors were brought on board. With the arrival of Officer Lowe, it became known that Boat A has been abandoned. And then when Lightoller arrives on Boat 12, it becomes known that Collapsible B has also been abandoned. So that means they must now pick up the total count of boats should be 18. Here are some photographs of the rescue. Here we can see boats 4 and 6 approaching the Carpathia. Quartermaster Hitchens and Lookout Fleet can be seen in Boat 6, while the man standing in Boat 4 is most likely Quartermaster Perkis. Here Boat 9 is being stored on the deck of the Carpathia, and boats 14 and 11 are unloading their occupants. Here Boat 16 is being tied to the Carpathia, while the other photograph is of a sailor from the Carpathia's crew on the morning after the sinking. Here Boat 14 is shown approaching the Carpathia. So the mast in Boat 14 is that of the sail which Lowe used earlier during the night, and Lowe is actually the man standing at the tiller, and they are towing Collapsible D. And in the other photograph you can see Boat 12 being picked up by the cargo cranes of the Carpathia. And here are the Carpathia's crew members, mostly from the cabin department, on deck on the morning after the sinking. Rostron orders the ship's house flag at half-mast to symbolize mourning. At 8 a.m., the quartermaster strikes 8 bells. The lookout in the nest replies, "All's well," and lights burning brightly. Bissett writes that this sounded like a parody of the real situation, but nevertheless it actually had a meaning. Hankinson is relieved by Bissett, though both are on duty since Rostron wake them up. Lightoller arrives in boat 12 and informs them that Collapsible B has been abandoned. After counting, it is revealed that all the Titanic's boats have been picked up. 712 people have been saved, but everybody else is lost. Just then, the SS Californian shows up. Here's a photograph of the Californian taken from the deck of Carpathia. At 8 a.m., the two ships exchange flag signals. Bissett holds the flags on Carpathia while another officer holds it on the Californian. They exchange message. Titanic hit berg and sank here with loss of 1,500 lives. Have picked up all our boats with 700 survivors. Please stay in vicinity to search for bodies. Rostron requests passenger Father Robert Anderson to conduct a Thanksgiving service with the survivors. Here they sing the hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Then he orders as many of Titanic's lifeboats to be taken on board as possible. 13 are. The rest are set adrift and the Carpathia cruises around the area, searching for survivors. But upon finding none, as expected, the Carpathia leaves the area. Thank you for watching.